Imagine a quiet autumn evening in the rolling hills of rural America, where the scent of ripening fruit hangs heavy in the air. You wander off the beaten path, drawn by the allure of an orchard that seems too perfect to be real rows of trees heavy with crimson apples, their branches bowing under the weight of unnatural bounty. But as you brush aside fallen leaves, your hand strikes something cold and unyielding beneath the soil. Not a root, a bone. And in that moment, the sweet promise of harvest twists into something far more sinister. A graveyard disguised as paradise. Welcome to the harrowing true story of one farmer's descent into madness, where every bite of fruit carried the taste of buried secrets. What you're about to hear will make you question the ground beneath your feet. Stay with me. This tale from the shadows of Harlan County, Kentucky, uncovers horrors that time couldn't bury. In the autumn of 1912, a season of biting winds and early frosts in the rugged hollows of Harlan County, Kentucky, two young brothers, Finn and Sawyer Brooks, were chasing a runaway dog through the dense woods bordering the Voss farm. The farm was a place children were warned away from, not with explicit threats, but with a quiet parental gravity that was more effective than any punishment. The property belonged to Harlan Voss, a man known for the unnatural perfection of his apple orchard and his equally unnatural reclusiveness. The dog, heedless of local folklore, scrambled down a steep, rain-gullied embankment at the orchard's edge. The boys, chasing the sound of its frantic barking, slid down after it. It was there, in the freshly carved channel of mud and loose rock, that Finn's boot struck something hard and pale. It was not a stone, 'twas a human femur, bleached white and scrubbed clean by the earth. A few feet away, Sawyer found a rusted shoe buckle, its leather long since rotted into nothingness. The dog was pawing at a patch of darker soil, from which protruded the unmistakable curve of a human rib cage. The boys, raised on stories of mine, collapses, and logging accidents, were not unfamiliar with the specter of death. But this was different. This was not an accident. This was a grave, shallow and forgotten, revealed by the chance erosion of a single storm. They ran home, their faces ashen, the dogs barking forgotten. Their father, a sober-minded coal miner, listened to their breathless story before walking the 2 miles to notify Sheriff Amos Fletcher. The sheriff's reaction, however, was not what anyone expected. He listened patiently, then dismissed the finding as likely animal bones, or perhaps part of an old, unregistered family plot from a century before. He promised to look into it when the weather cleared, a promise that, to the residents of Harlan County, was understood as a promise to do nothing at all. The disturbing cold case of Harlan Voss's orchard had just begun, not with an investigation, but with a deliberate act of looking away. The official disinterest of Sheriff Fletcher might have been the end of the matter. Strange discovery, destined to be buried by the next rain and forgotten. But the story reached the ears of his new deputy, Ethan Carver. Carver was only 24, an outsider from Louisville who had taken the post in Harlan County, seeking experience and a quiet life. He possessed an idealistic belief in the letter of the law that the mountain communities found both naive and unsettling. He had been a deputy for less than 6 months and had already learned that justice in these isolated hollows operated on its own unwritten code of conduct, a code that prioritized stability over truth. He overheard the Brooks brothers' father recounting the incident at the general store, his voice a mixture of frustration and fear. The father spoke of how the sheriff had seemed more annoyed than concerned, how he had warned him not to spread morbid fantasies. This casual dismissal pricked at Carver's conscience. He knew, as did everyone, of the Voss farm's reputation. It was a sprawling property tucked away in a narrow valley, dominated by an orchard of unsettling orderliness. Harlan Voss himself was a specter in the community, seen only a few times a year when he brought his flawless blood-red apples to market. He was a widower, his wife having died of a fever a decade prior, and he lived and worked his land alone. He spoke to no one, and no one spoke to him. Locals referred to his property not by his name, but simply as the orchard, a place where the soil was said to be too rich and the fruit grew too sweet. These were the whispers Carver had initially dismissed as provincial superstition. Now, hearing of the discovered bones, the folklore took on a far more sinister resonance. That evening, against the silent advice of his own instincts for self-preservation, Deputy Carver opened the county's ledger of missing persons reports, a dusty, leather-bound volume whose pages were filled with the stories of those the mountains had quietly swallowed. The ledger was a grim catalog of human impermanence. Most entries were for miners lost to collapses, loggers crushed by falling trees, or travelers who had simply vanished on the winding, poorly marked roads that snaked through the Appalachian wilderness. The official explanations were uniformly brief. Presumed deceased, moved on without notice, no foul play suspected. Yet, as Carver spent hours poring over the records dating back 20 years, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. The disappearances were not random. There was a clear geographic concentration. At least 18 men, all of them outsiders, itinerant farmhands, traveling salesmen, land surveyors, had last been seen on the old turnpike that ran directly past Harlan Voss's property. For each one, the last point of contact was a local who recalled seeing the man walking toward the Voss Valley. In 1896, a peddler named John Soloway vanished. In 1899, 2 railroad surveyors, their names unrecorded. In 1905, a man seeking work at the coal seems remembered only as Henderson. The list went on. None of these men had family in the area. None had connections that would prompt a serious, sustained investigation. They were ghosts, their existence noted only by their sudden absence. What disturbed Carver most was the perfunctory nature of the reports filed by Sheriff Fletcher. The investigations were cursory at best, consisting of a few questions asked at the general store before the case was summarily closed. It was more than simple negligence. It was a willful, systematic refusal to connect the dots. The Voss farm was never mentioned in any of the official reports, despite being the last known location for so many of the vanished. The property existed as a black hole in the official record, a place to which all trails led, but from which no information ever emerged. Carver felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This was not a series of unfortunate accidents. This was a hunting ground, and the local authorities, for reasons he could not yet fathom, were acting as its gatekeepers. To understand the darkness that festered in Harlan County, one had to understand the land itself. This was a part of Kentucky carved by isolation. Families had lived in the same hollows for generations, their bonds forged by shared hardship, their loyalties absolute, and their suspicion of outsiders deeply ingrained. The world beyond the mountains was a foreign country. Here, the only laws that truly mattered were those of blood and tradition. Harlan Voss's family had been among the first to settle this valley in the late 1700s. They had carved their farm from a wilderness that was said to be cursed, a place the native tribes had shunned. The Vosses, however, had not just survived. They had thrived. Their land was unusually fertile, their livestock strangely resilient to disease, and their harvests always bountiful, even when neighboring farms suffered from blight or drought. Over generations, this unnatural prosperity became entwined with local folklore. Whispers circulated of a pact made with the land itself, a dark agreement that ensured the family's success. When Harlan inherited the farm, the last of his line, the legends grew darker. After his wife's death, he tore down the old cornfields and tobacco patches, dedicating every acre to his apple orchard. The trees he planted grew with an unsettling speed, their trunks thick and their leaves a deep, waxy green. The apples they produced were famous throughout the region, perfectly formed, unnaturally large, and with a crimson skin so deep it was almost black. People paid a premium for Voss's apples, yet many confessed to eating them with a sense of unease. They were too perfect, their sweetness cloying, leaving a strange metallic aftertaste. Mothers would tell their children not to eat the core, warning that Voss seeds would take root in you. These were the stories Deputy Carver began to collect, speaking to old-timers in hushed conversations on front porches after dusk. They were tales meant to scare. But beneath the superstition, Carver sensed a foundation of truth. They were the community's way of explaining something they could not or would not confront directly. Deputy Carver decided his first concrete step would be to investigate the land itself, specifically the area where the Brooks boys had found the bones. Without notifying Sheriff Fletcher, he rode out to the Voss property at dawn, tethering his horse a half-mile away and approaching the orchard's edge on foot. The air grew still and heavy as he drew closer. The cacophony of forest life, the birds, the insects, seemed to mute, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the soil. The orchard was a masterpiece of chilling precision. Hundreds of apple trees stood in perfectly straight rows, each spaced exactly the same distance from its neighbors. Not a single weed grew between them. The ground beneath the canopy was a carpet of dark, loamy soil, strangely bare and soft, as if it had been recently tilled. Carver found the rain gully easily. The area had been disturbed. Fresh dirt and stones had been piled into the channel, a clumsy attempt to rebury what the storm had unearthed. Carver didn't need to dig far. Using his hands, he scraped away the loose soil and immediately found more bones. A piece of a jawbone with several teeth still intact, a collection of vertebrae, and a small silver button bearing the insignia of a popular brand of traveler's coat from the 1890s. This was no ancient burial plot. He was kneeling in the grave of a man who had likely been murdered. As he worked, he became aware of the smell. It was a sickly sweet odor, like rotting meat mixed with the cloying fragrance of fermenting apples. It clung to the air, thick and nauseating. And then he saw it. The root system of the nearest apple tree had grown down into the shallow grave. Thick, fibrous tendrils stained a dark, rusty brown had wormed their way through the rib cage and wrapped themselves around the bones, drawing sustenance from the decay. The tree was feeding on the dead. Carver scrambled back, a wave of revulsion washing over him. The legends were true. The soil was rich for a reason. The entire orchard was a graveyard. Shaken, Carver returned to town with the silver button and the jawbone fragment wrapped in his handkerchief. He knew presenting this evidence to Sheriff Fletcher would be futile. The man would find a way to explain it away, to bury it in paperwork, just as the bones had been buried in the earth. Carver needed something undeniable, a victim with a name and a history that could not be so easily dismissed. He spent the next week locked in the county clerk's office, cross-referencing the missing persons ledger with tax records, property deeds, and old census data. He was searching for a ghost, a name that could be tied to a face, a family, a life that existed beyond the borders of Harlan County. He finally found him in a report from the spring of 1907. Leonard Hayes, a 42-year-old salesman for a Louisville-based pharmaceutical company. Hayes was a man of meticulous habits. His company had reported him missing after he failed to check in for 2 consecutive weeks. He traveled with a detailed itinerary, and his last letter to his wife mentioned he was heading to Harlan County to service the small mining town apothecaries. He described his route, which would take him directly past the Voss farm. The report filed by a concerned regional manager included a photograph. Hayes was a handsome man with a neat mustache and kind eyes. The case file was thin. Sheriff Fletcher had concluded that Hayes, a city man unaccustomed to the rugged terrain, had likely fallen victim to the wilderness, his body lost to the elements. Case closed, but Carver found something Fletcher had missed or ignored. Tucked into the back of the file was a follow-up letter from Hayes's widow pleading with the sheriff to investigate a peculiar transaction. A month after her husband's disappearance, several of his personal items, a custom-engraved pocket watch, a set of silver-backed hairbrushes, and a fine leather satchel, had appeared in a pawn shop in Lexington, a city 60 miles away. The pawnbroker's description of the man who sold them was vague, but he mentioned the man smelled faintly of apples. The connection to the pawned items was the first solid lead in a case built on whispers and shadows. Carver knew a 60-mile ride to Lexington would be impossible to hide from Sheriff Fletcher. He would need a plausible reason to be away for at least 2 days. He fabricated a story about a family emergency, a sick aunt in a neighboring county, and requested a short leave of absence. Fletcher granted it with an unsettling lack of curiosity, his eyes betraying a weary sort of pity, as if he knew the young deputy was chasing phantoms, and was content to let him exhaust himself. Carver rode hard, the image of Leonard Hayes's kind eyes haunting him. This was no longer an abstract puzzle of names in a ledger. It was about a man who had a wife, a life, a story that had been brutally cut short and then deliberately erased. The pawn shop in Lexington was a grimy, cluttered establishment on a bustling street. The owner, a man named Elias Thorne, was old now, his memory clouded by the years, but he kept meticulous records. After Carver showed him Hayes's photograph and explained the situation, Thorne's memory was jogged. He remembered the items, particularly the expensive-looking watch. He shuffled to a back room and returned with a dusty ledger from 1907. The entry was there. April 17, 1907. 1 gold-plated pocket watch, 1 leather satchel, 1 set of silver brushes. The name given by the seller was Eubidia Jones, a common enough name to be an alias. But Thorne remembered one more detail. The fellow was a local man from your part of the country. He told me he used to do odd jobs for folks. Said he won the items in a poker game from a traveling man who couldn't cover his debts. A likely story, but his coin was good. Thorne couldn't recall the man's real name, but he provided a description. Tall, gaunt, with a ragged beard and a missing front tooth. More importantly, he confirmed the detail from the widow's letter. Now that I think on it, Thorne added, scratching his chin. He had this strange smell about him, sweet but off, like apples left to rot in the sun. A man from Harlan County, smelling of rotten apples, selling a murdered man's possessions. Carver felt the pieces clicking into place. He rode back from Lexington with a renewed sense of purpose, but also a growing unease. The description of the man who sold Hayes's belongings did not match Harlan Voss. This meant Voss had an accomplice, someone who could move about in the outside world without attracting the same suspicion as the reclusive farmer. It also meant the conspiracy of silence might extend beyond just the sheriff. Who was this Eubidia Jones? Back in Harlan County, Carver started asking discreet questions about a tall, gaunt man with a missing tooth who did odd jobs. The name that came back was Silas Kane. He was a distant cousin of the pawnbroker, a local drunk and petty thief who lived in a shack on the edge of the county. He was precisely the kind of man who would do dirty work for a few dollars, a man whose own disappearance would go unnoticed and unmourned. Carver checked the county records. Silas Kane had been arrested several times for public intoxication and brawling, but his file went cold in the summer of 1907, just a few months after he had sold Leonard Hayes's belongings. There was no death certificate, no record of him moving away. Like so many others, he had simply vanished. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. Voss wasn't just killing strangers. He was eliminating his own loose ends. Silas Kane had served his purpose by disposing of the evidence, and for his service, he had likely earned himself a permanent place in the unhallowed soil of the orchard. The macabre economy of the farm was revealing itself. Voss took the lives of his victims, and their possessions were used to pay for the silence and complicity of others. This was a web, and Carver feared he was only just beginning to grasp its horrifying size. The feeling of being watched, which he had first felt at the orchard, now followed him everywhere, even in the supposed safety of the town. The investigation had reached a dangerous turning point. Carver now had a named victim, a tangible link to a potential accomplice, and a growing certainty that the town's leadership was compromised. He had to confront Sheriff Fletcher. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until the end of the day when the two of them were alone in the small, cramped office. He laid out his findings on the sheriff's desk: the photograph of Leonard Hayes, the pawnbroker's ledger entry, the records of Silas Kane's disappearance, and finally, the silver button he had found in the shallow grave. He spoke calmly, detailing the pattern of vanished travelers, the geographical anomaly, the rumors, and the physical evidence. Fletcher listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight, and steepled his fingers. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken threats. "Son," Fletcher said finally, his voice low and gravelly, "you are meddling with things you don't understand, things that were settled long before you ever set foot in these mountains." He gestured to the evidence on his desk. "This is nothing. A coincidence? A string of sad, unrelated tragedies that you're weaving into a grand conspiracy because you're bored." But his eyes told a different story. There was no dismissal in them, only a profound weariness and a flicker of fear. "Harlan Voss is a respected man," Fletcher continued, his voice hardening. "His family built this county. You will not tarnish his name with these fantasies. You are a guest here, Carver. Remember that? Let the dead stay buried. It's better for everyone." It was not a suggestion. It was a command and an unmistakable threat. Carver had shown his hand, and in doing so, he had isolated himself completely. He was no longer just an outsider investigating a cold case. He was a direct threat to a dark and deeply rooted secret that the entire community seemed determined to protect. As he left the office that night, he knew he could trust no one. The next move he made would have to be his last. Fletcher's warning had the opposite of its intended effect. The sheriff's thinly veiled threat confirmed Carver's darkest suspicions. This was a cover-up, one that was active and ongoing. He knew his time was running short. Fletcher would be watching him now, perhaps even reporting his activities to Voss himself. Carver had to find a way to get inside the Voss house. He needed documents, journals, trophies, anything that would provide irrefutable proof of the horrors that had taken place in the orchard. He spent 2 days watching the farm from a wooded ridge, mapping out Harlan Voss's routine. The man was a creature of unshakable habit. He rose before dawn, tended to the orchard until noon, ate a solitary meal on his porch, and then worked in his barn until dusk. He never had visitors and never left the property. The only time the house was empty was on the last Thursday of the month, when Voss made the long journey by wagon to the next county to sell his apples and acquire supplies. Carver checked the calendar. The last Thursday was 3 days away. The wait was agonizing. He felt a constant prickling paranoia, seeing suspicion in the eyes of every person he passed on the street. The town, which had once seemed merely quiet and reserved, now felt suffocatingly hostile. During this time, an old woman, the town's unofficial historian and gossip, stopped him outside the general store. She had heard he was asking questions about the old Voss place. In a voice barely above a whisper, she told him a story her grandfather had told her. She spoke of the bargain tree, the oldest apple tree in the orchard, the first one planted by the Voss ancestors. Legend said the tree's roots reached down into a place of great hunger, and that the family's prosperity was dependent on feeding the roots. The toll, she said, was a life for each generation. But her grandfather had claimed that Harlan's father had broken the pact, refusing to pay the price. As a result, a blight had fallen on the farm until Harlan took over, and the orchard began to flourish with a terrifying, unnatural vitality. He wasn't just honoring the bargain, she whispered. Kay was making up for lost time. The day of Voss's trip finally arrived. Carver watched from his hiding place as the farmer's wagon, laden with crates of gleaming red apples, rumbled down the long dirt track and disappeared from view. He gave it an hour before descending from the ridge and approaching the farmhouse. The silence was absolute. The house was a simple 2-story clapboard structure, well-maintained but stark. There were no decorations, no signs of life beyond a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. The windows were like vacant eyes watching him. He found a back window unlatched and slipped inside. The interior was obsessively clean and Spartan. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke, beeswax, and faintly of apples. Every object was in its proper place, every surface polished. It was the home of a man who craved order, a chilling counterpoint to the chaotic violence Carver knew he was responsible for. He moved quickly, searching for anything that could serve as evidence. In the downstairs study, he found ledgers detailing the farm's finances. The apple sales were lucrative, but there were also entries for large, unexplained cash payments to various individuals in the county, including Sheriff Fletcher. It was a record of bribery, of silence bought and paid for. In a locked desk drawer, Carver found a small wooden box. Prying it open, he found a collection of macabre trophies: a woman's silver locket, a pair of spectacles, a railroad union pin, a single child's shoe, and a gold-plated pocket watch, its back engraved with the initials L. H. Leonard Hayes. Carver felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was it. This was the proof. But it was what he found next in a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath the floorboards in the master bedroom that revealed the true depth of Harlan Voss's horrifying madness. The journal was not a record of his crimes, but a philosophical treatise, a testament to his own twisted faith. The journal's entries were written in a neat, precise script. Voss did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a steward, a priest tending a sacred garden. He wrote of the hunger below, a primal force within the soil of his valley that demanded sacrifice. "The world is full of wandering souls," he wrote in one entry, "men without roots, without purpose. They drift upon the surface, taking and giving nothing. I offer them a purpose. I offer them roots. I plant them in the good soil, and from their meaningless endings, life blossoms." He described his victims not with malice, but with a chilling detachment, as if they were mere ingredients in a grand agricultural project. He referred to them as the unclaimed. The journal detailed his methods with meticulous scientific precision. He would lure travelers to his farm with the promise of a hot meal and a place to sleep. He spoke of how he would watch them, study them, determining if they were suitable for the soil. He believed he could see a hollowness in their eyes, a lack of connection to the world that marked them as his. The act itself was described as a transplanting, a return to the earth. He believed that by burying them beneath his apple trees, he was granting them a form of immortality. Their transient flesh and blood transformed into the eternal cycle of the seasons, into the perfect crimson fruit of his harvest. The most disturbing passages revealed the community's role in his madness. He wrote of the covenant of the fruit. He knew the town suspected, but they were bound to him by the prosperity his orchard provided. His apples were a local commodity, their sale bringing much-needed money into the impoverished county. The bribes were merely a formality. The true payment was the shared, unspoken guilt. As long as the victims were outsiders, as long as the harvest was plentiful, the people of Harlan County would look the other way. They were all eating from the forbidden tree. As Carver read, the faint scent of apples in the house grew stronger, more oppressive until it felt like he was drowning in it. He pocketed the journal and the box of trophies. This was more than enough. With this evidence, he could go to the state authorities, bypass Fletcher and the corrupt county system entirely. As he prepared to leave, a glint of light from the corner of the bedroom caught his eye. It was a small framed photograph on the bedside table, the only personal item in the entire house. It was a portrait of a woman with a gentle, sad smile, Harlan Voss's wife. Beneath the photograph was a small, tarnished silver plaque. It was not an inscription of a name or a date, but a quote. "The first fruit is always the sweetest." A horrifying realization dawned on Carver. He remembered the town gossip mentioning that Voss had started the orchard only after his wife had died of a fever. He rushed out of the house and to the center of the orchard, to the largest, most ancient-looking apple tree that stood in the very heart of the geometric pattern. The bargain tree from the old woman's legend. The ground at its base was marked by a simple, unadorned stone, like a forgotten headstone. Carver didn't need to dig. He knew with absolute certainty what or who was buried there. Harlan Voss's first victim, the first fruit planted to nourish his cursed garden, had been his own wife. His madness wasn't born of a family curse. 'Twas born of a personal, monstrous act that he had then sanctified through decades of ritualistic slaughter. This horrifying truth provided a key to his psyche, but it also raised a darker question. If this truth were to come out, it wouldn't just expose a murderer. It would unravel the entire moral fabric of Harlan County. Carver fled the Voss farm, his mind reeling from the sickening revelations. He rode east toward the state capital, pushing his horse to its limit. He didn't dare return to the town. He knew now that Sheriff Fletcher was not just a complicit bystander, but an active participant. And the box of trophies in Voss's journal were effectively Carver's death warrant in Harlan County. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that crossed his path felt like an approaching threat. He imagined Voss returning home, finding the window ajar, the desk drawer forced open, the journal gone. He imagined the farmer's cold, methodical rage. He imagined the message that would be sent to the sheriff. He was no longer a lawman. He was a fugitive carrying a terrible truth. He rode for 2 days straight, sleeping only in short, fitful bursts in hidden groves far from the main road. When he finally reached Frankfort, he went directly to the office of the state police. He was met with skepticism. A young, frantic deputy from a backwater county telling a wild tale of a murderous farmer, a corrupt sheriff, and a graveyard orchard sounded like the ravings of a madman. They listened, their faces impassive as he laid out the story, his voice thick with exhaustion and urgency. But then he presented the evidence. He opened the wooden box, and the small personal items of the dead fell silently onto the polished desk of the state captain. He handed over the pocket watch, its inscription clearly visible. Finally, he presented the journal. An officer began to read the cold, meticulous prose aloud, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from disbelief to horrified concentration. The captain read the entry about Leonard Hayes, the account of his transplanting, and then cross-referenced the date with the missing persons report from 1907. It was a perfect match. There was no more doubt. Carver was not insane. He had stumbled into a nightmare, and he had brought back proof. Within hours, a plan was in motion. A team of 12 state officers was assembled, a force large enough to overwhelm any potential local resistance. They would travel in unmarked carriages, arriving in Harlan County under the cover of darkness. Deputy Carver, despite his exhaustion, insisted on guiding them. He knew the terrain, he knew the farm, and he felt a grim responsibility to see this through to its conclusion. The journey back was surreal. Riding with the quiet, heavily armed state officers, Carver felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching events unfold from a great distance. The familiar mountains now seemed alien, their dark wooded slopes hiding a malevolence he had never before understood. They arrived at the ridge overlooking the Voss farm just before dawn. The house was dark, but a single lantern burned in the barn. Voss was awake. The captain laid out the plan. They would surround the property, cutting off any escape routes. A small team, led by Carver, would approach the house to make the arrest, while other officers would secure the orchard and begin the grim task of confirming the graves. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, the officers moved into position. The silence of the valley was broken only by the crunch of their boots on the damp earth. Carver approached the front porch, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the culmination of everything. The whispers, the records, the bones, the journal. He was about to confront the monster at the heart of the labyrinth. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the pre-dawn stillness. There was a long moment of silence, and then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door creaked open, and Harlan Voss stood before them. He was not what Carver had expected. He was a small, wiry man with pale, intelligent eyes. He was holding a half-eaten apple in one hand and showed no signs of surprise or fear. He looked at Carver, then at the armed officers behind him, and took a calm, deliberate bite of the apple. "You've been busy," he said, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "I suppose you'll be wanting to see my work." Harlan Voss's surrender was unnervingly placid. He offered no resistance as the officers placed him in handcuffs. His calm detachment was more unsettling than any outburst of rage would have been. He seemed to view his arrest as an inevitable, almost trivial conclusion to his life's work. As he was being led away, he paused and looked back at his orchard, where the first rays of sun were catching the dew on the leaves. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "The harvest has been good this year," he murmured to no one in particular. While Voss was secured, the other officers began their search of the orchard. They started with the bargain tree at the center. It took 2 men less than 10 minutes of digging in the soft, rich earth to strike the lid of a crude wooden coffin. Inside were the skeletal remains of a woman, a single, irreparable fracture in her skull, confirming the cause of death. It was Lydia Voss, the first seed in this garden of horror. From there, the officers spread out, following the chillingly logical pattern Voss himself had created. They chose a tree at random in the first row and began to dig at its base, and then another and another. Each time, the result was the same. Beneath the roots of every single apple tree was a human skeleton. Some were buried deep, others engraved so shallow that the roots had fused with the bones, creating a grotesque hybrid of life and death. The state officers, all of them hardened veterans of law enforcement, worked in a stunned, grim silence. They had seen gruesome crime scenes before, but this was something else entirely. This was not the work of a common murderer. It was a monument to a deeply personal and systematic madness. The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible. The orchard contained over 220 trees. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the valley, the full, horrifying scope of Harlan Voss's 28-year reign of terror was just beginning to be unearthed. The news of the raid on the Voss farm spread through Harlan County like a wildfire. At first, there was disbelief, then outrage. The initial reaction was not horror at Voss's crimes, but anger at the outside interference of the state police. Sheriff Fletcher arrived at the scene, his face a mask of fury, demanding to know what was happening when the state captain presented him with the arrest warrant for Voss and then a second one for himself for obstruction of justice, corruption, and accessory to murder. The sheriff's bluster collapsed into a shocked, sputtering silence. As Fletcher was taken into custody, the town's collective denial began to crumble. The sight of their sheriff being led away in cuffs was a shock to the system, a violation of the established order. The community that had been bound by a covenant of silence began to fracture. People gathered at the edge of the Voss property, watching in mute horror as body after body was exhumed from the orchard. The neat rows of trees were now surrounded by a chaotic landscape of open graves and canvas-wrapped remains. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, a smell that overwhelmed the sweet scent of the apples that still hung from the branches. The fruit, once a source of pride and prosperity, now seemed grotesque. Its perfect crimson skin, a testament to the blood that had nourished it. Men and women who had known Harlan Voss their entire lives, who had bought his apples and praised his farm, were now forced to confront the truth they had so long avoided. They had suspected, they had whispered, but they had chosen not to know. Now the evidence was laid bare at their feet, and their shared guilt was as palpable as the morning mist that clung to the valley floor. The orchard was no longer a place of local legend. It had become a national spectacle, a place that would forever be known as the Devil's Acre. The excavation of the orchard took over a week. Every day brought a more horrifying tally. The final count was staggering. 167 bodies. 167 lives ended and consumed by Harlan Voss's macabre vision. The victims were, as Carver had suspected, mostly transients and travelers. But there were others. The remains of Silas Kane were identified by a distinctive mended break in his leg. They also found the skeletons of women and, most disturbingly, 3 children. These discoveries shattered the town's last remaining illusion that Voss had only targeted those without roots. The truth was that his hunger was indiscriminate. He had preyed on anyone who was vulnerable, anyone whose disappearance would not cause an immediate alarm. The state investigators, working from Voss's own meticulous journal and the trophies he had kept, were able to identify 31 of the victims, including Leonard Hayes. For the other 136, they were simply skeletons, their names and stories lost to time. Their only legacy, the unnatural vitality of the trees that had grown from their bodies. The trial of Harlan Voss was a national sensation. Newspapers dubbed him the orchard keeper and the apple tree butcher. He sat through the proceedings with the same calm indifference he had shown on the day of his arrest. He confessed to every murder, providing chillingly detailed accounts of his methods and his philosophy. He showed no remorse, only a quiet pride in his life's work. When asked by the prosecutor why he had done it, his answer silenced the courtroom. "The land is hungry," he stated as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. "A farmer must feed his soil. I was a good farmer." It took the jury less than an hour to find him guilty. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Sheriff Fletcher, in a separate trial, was convicted of corruption and sentenced to life in prison, where he died of a heart attack 6 months later, never having spoken another word about Harlan Voss. On the day of his execution, Harlan Voss had one final request. He asked for an apple, one of his own. A guard, against regulations, but compelled by a morbid curiosity, was dispatched to the now barren orchard to find one of the last remaining apples from the previous year's harvest. It was brought to Voss in his cell. He held it in his hands, admiring its perfect shape and deep red color. He did not eat it. He simply held it as he was led to the gallows. His last words spoken to the priest who offered him final rites were not of repentance. He looked at the priest, then at the apple in his hand, and said, "Do you see? Even in death, there is life. We all feed the soil in the end." I simply made the process more efficient. He was hanged at dawn, his death marking the official end of the disturbing cold case. The town of Harlan County tried to move on to erase the stain of the Voss orchard. The property was seized by the state. The remaining apple trees were cut down and burned in a massive pyre that smoldered for days, casting a pall of greasy, sweet-smelling smoke over the valley. The ground was then plowed and salted, a symbolic act of purification meant to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. The Voss house was torn down, its foundations filled in. But a place so saturated in death cannot be so easily cleansed. The story of the orchard keeper became a permanent part of Kentucky's dark folklore, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. The town's name became synonymous with murder, its people forever marked by the secrets they had kept. The prosperity that the orchard had brought them vanished, replaced by a legacy of shame and horror. They had made a covenant with a monster, and even with the monster gone, the debt remained. The land itself seemed to remember. For years after the orchard was destroyed, locals claimed that the salted earth still gave off a faint, sweet smell of apples after a heavy rain. Deputy Ethan Carver did not stay in Harlan County. He had seen the darkness that lay beneath the surface of the quiet, rural community, and he could no longer look at his neighbors without seeing the shadow of their complicity. He testified at the trials, his calm, factual account providing the framework upon which the prosecution built its case. He was hailed as a hero by the state, a paragon of justice who had single-handedly exposed a decades-long conspiracy. But Carver did not feel like a hero. He felt haunted. He was haunted by the faces of the unidentified victims, by the cold, rational madness in Harlan Voss's journal, and by the memory of the town's collective silence. He resigned his post and moved back to Louisville, taking a desk job with the state police, a position far removed from the grim realities of fieldwork. He never spoke of the Voss case again, but those who knew him said that he was a changed man. He became quiet and withdrawn, prone to long periods of silent contemplation. He never married and had no children. He lived out his life in a small, tidy apartment, the walls of which were bare, save for a single framed photograph on his mantelpiece. It was not of family or friends. 'Twas the photograph of Leonard Hayes, the traveling salesman whose kind eyes had set the entire investigation in motion. It was a private memorial, a reminder of the one man he had been able to pull back from the anonymity of the orchard, the one name he had been able to return to the world. In the years that followed, the story of the Voss orchard was frequently sensationalized, becoming the subject of lurid pulp novels and macabre campfire tales. The truth of the matter, however, was far more disturbing than any fiction. It was a story not just of a single deranged killer, but of a community that had, through fear and greed, allowed him to flourish. It was a story of how evil can take root and grow in plain sight, nurtured by the silent consent of the good. What became of the land itself is a story that continues to this day. The state-sanctioned destruction of the orchard was not the end. The plot of land remained barren for nearly 50 years, a toxic salted scar in the valley. No one dared to build on it, and the county officially zoned it as unusable. It was a place to be avoided, a geographical reminder of the town's shame. Yet, in the late 1960s, something began to change. First, a few hardy species of weeds began to push their way through the poisoned soil. Then, saplings, not apple, but wild cherry and black walnut, started to take root along the property's edge. Nature, it seemed, was slowly reclaiming the Devil's Acre. By the 1980s, the land was covered in a dense, tangled thicket of new-growth forest. Local authorities, hoping to finally put the past to rest, incorporated the former Voss property into a new state park. They cut hiking trails through the woods and built a small picnic area near the creek. But the land did not forget. Hikers who wandered off the marked trails often reported a strange and unsettling phenomenon. In the area where the orchard once stood, the woods would go unnaturally silent. The air would become cold and still, and a faint, sickly sweet smell, like that of rotting apples, would rise from the ground. Some claimed to hear faint whispers carried on the wind, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the earth beneath their feet. Park rangers dismissed these stories as the products of overactive imaginations fueled by the area's dark history. But they, too, had their own private rules. They would never camp on that specific patch of land overnight, and they always made sure to be out of the valley before sunset. They would not admit it publicly, but they knew. They knew that some places are born bad, and that no amount of time or salt can ever truly wash away the stain of what happened there. The hunger that Harlan Voss had served for so long was still present, sleeping just beneath the surface, waiting. The legacy of the Voss orchard extends beyond folklore and unsettling feelings. It left a permanent psychological scar on the descendants of the families who had lived through it. For generations, children in Harlan County were raised with a new set of warnings. They were taught to be wary of strangers, but also to be wary of their own neighbors. They were taught that silence could be a sin and that some secrets have a terrible cost. The phrase "to plant an apple" entered the local lexicon as a dark euphemism for making a problem permanently disappear. The economic impact was also devastating. The notoriety of the case drove away investment in tourism for decades. The town became a pariah, a place known only for its most infamous resident. The very name of Harlan County became a shorthand for rural horror, a real-life cautionary tale about the darkness that can fester in isolated places. And then there are the objects. While the state collected most of the evidence, many of Voss's tools, the shovels, the pruning shears, the wheelbarrows used to transport the bodies, were sold off at a county auction before the full scope of the crimes was understood. These macabre relics were scattered throughout the region, purchased by unsuspecting farmers and collectors. Over the years, a strange and disturbing pattern of misfortune has been associated with these items. Families who owned a Voss shovel reported streaks of bad luck, unexplained illnesses, and a pervasive sense of being watched. One family claimed that a pruning shear found in their barn after they bought an old farm would sometimes be covered in a dark, sticky sap that smelled vaguely of iron, even though it hadn't been used in years. These are, of course, just stories, but in a place like Harlan County, stories have power. They are the ghosts of the past, and they serve as a constant reminder that while Harlan Voss may be dead, the evil he cultivated has put down deep and lasting roots. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Voss case is not what was found, but what remains unknown. Despite the discovery of 167 bodies, investigators at the time were convinced that the true number of victims was far higher. Voss's journal, while detailed, was also incomplete. There were gaps in the timeline, years where he made no entries at all. Furthermore, the number of missing persons reports from the region that fit the pattern of his crimes far exceeded the number of bodies exhumed. So where are the other victims? One theory posits that Voss used other, more remote locations on his vast property for burials, places that the 1912 investigation never found. The search had focused exclusively on the orchard, the site of his most symbolic work, but the farm encompassed hundreds of acres of dense, unforgiving woodland. It is possible, even probable, that dozens more skeletons lie in unmarked graves scattered throughout the hills. Their final resting place is known only to the killer himself. Another more disturbing theory was proposed by Ethan Carver himself in a private letter written years after the trial. He noted the unusual fertility of the entire valley, not just the orchard. He speculated that Voss's family had been practicing their dark form of agriculture for generations, and that Harlan was not an anomaly, but the last and most prolific practitioner of an ancient, horrifying family tradition. He wondered how many bodies had been transplanted into that soil over the centuries. Their identities lost to history, their essence fueling the unnatural vitality of the land. If Carver's theory is correct, then the entire valley is a cemetery, a vast, unhallowed ground saturated with the remains of the lost and the forgotten. The 167 bodies found in the orchard were not the full story. They were merely the final horrifying chapter. The dark history of this place is a forbidden one. In the century since Harlan Voss's execution, several attempts have been made to scientifically study the former orchard land in the 1970s. A team of university botanists conducted a soil analysis, hoping to understand why the area had remained barren for so long after being salted. Their findings were inconclusive. While the sodium levels were still high, they were not sufficient to explain the complete lack of vegetation at the time. More puzzling was their discovery of unusually high concentrations of calcium and phosphorus, minerals consistent with decomposed bone at levels far exceeding what could be accounted for by the 167 known burials. The report noted that the soil composition was geologically anomalous and recommended further study, but funding was never approved. Then, in the early 2000s, a paranormal investigation team received permission to spend a night on the property. They came armed with electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, and digital audio recorders. Their subsequent television show was a predictable collection of ambiguous shadows and strange noises. However, one piece of evidence they collected has never been satisfactorily explained. They captured an electronic voice phenomenon, a faint, disembodied voice recorded on their equipment. When filtered and amplified, the voice does not seem to be speaking words, but rather humming a simple, repetitive tune. It was later identified as a popular but obscure lullaby from the 1880s. The sound of a child's song captured in a place of unimaginable slaughter is a chilling and inexplicable artifact. It serves as a haunting reminder of the 3 children found buried among the trees. Their stories unknown, their final moments a horrifying mystery. These scientific and pseudoscientific inquiries all point to the same conclusion. Something lingers in that valley, a residue of the immense suffering that took place there, an echo of the lives that were so brutally consumed by the soil. It's a presence that defies easy explanation, a ghost that cannot be exorcised by time or reason. The story of the Voss orchard also serves as a dark mirror to the broader history of the region. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of great upheaval in Appalachia. The expansion of coal mining and logging brought a massive influx of transient workers into these isolated communities. These men, disconnected from their families and homes, were the perfect victims. They were the unclaimed that Voss wrote of in his journal. Their disappearances were easily overlooked, their lives deemed expendable by a society that valued resources over people. Harlan Voss, in his own twisted way, was a predator who had perfectly adapted to his environment. He exploited the social conditions of his time, using the anonymity of the industrial boom to feed his personal madness. The authorities' willingness to ignore the disappearances of these itinerant workers was not unique to Harlan County. It was a common and unspoken policy throughout the region. A missing miner or logger was simply a logistical problem, a name to be crossed off a payroll. Voss's crimes were an extreme and monstrous manifestation of a more widespread societal indifference. He created his own personal system of exploitation, turning human beings into a resource to be harvested. Just as the coal and timber companies were harvesting the mountains themselves. This historical context makes the story even more disturbing. Voss was not just a monster who appeared out of nowhere. He was a product of his time and place, a cancer that grew in a society that was already sick with neglect and dehumanization. The roots of his evil ran far deeper than the soil of his own cursed orchard. They were entwined with the very history of the land he inhabited. He was a uniquely American nightmare born from the dark, forgotten corners of the nation's relentless push for progress. One of the enduring mysteries of the case is the question of Voss's journal. The original was entered into evidence at the trial and subsequently stored in the state archives, where it remains to this day sealed from public view. However, a partial transcript allegedly made by a clerk during the trial began to circulate in the 1950s. This transcript contains several passages that were never read in court, passages that the authorities may have deemed too disturbing or too inflammatory for public record. One such passage allegedly details Voss's belief that his apples carried a part of the victims' souls. He wrote that those who ate the fruit were unknowingly participating in his ritual, consuming the life force of the dead, and in doing so, strengthening the hunger below. He believed this created a psychic bond between the consumer and the land, making them more susceptible to its influence. They eat of my harvest, the transcript reads, and in turn, the harvest eats of them. Their silence, their compliance, is not a choice. It is a symptom of the soil that has entered their blood. This passage, if authentic, recasts the town's complicity in an even more sinister light. Were they simply greedy and fearful, or were they under the influence of a more subtle supernatural corruption? It also adds a horrifying new layer to the story of the orchard's prosperity. Were people buying the apples simply because they were large and sweet? Or were they drawn to them by an unnatural compulsion, an unconscious desire to partake in the forbidden sacrament? The idea is, of course, outlandish, and yet it provides a chilling, almost plausible explanation for how such a monstrous secret could be kept for so long. It suggests that the evil of the orchard was not just contained within its boundaries, but was spread seed by seed, bite by bite, into the very heart of the community that surrounded it. After his retirement, Ethan Carver lived a solitary life, but he never truly left the Voss case behind. In the 1950s, a historian conducting research on Appalachian crime interviewed the aging former deputy. Carver was reluctant to speak, but he eventually shared one final disturbing detail about the investigation, something he had never included in his official reports. On the day of the arrest, after Voss had been taken away, Carver had a moment alone in the farmer's house before it was sealed as a crime scene. He went back to the master bedroom and stood for a long moment before the empty space under the floorboards where the journal had been hidden. On a sudden impulse, he reached deep into the dark, dusty cavity. His fingers brushed against something small and hard. It was a single, perfectly preserved apple seed. Carver said he was overcome with a strange and powerful urge to pocket the seed, to keep it as a memento. But as he held it in the palm of his hand, he claimed it felt unnaturally warm, and he could have sworn he felt it pulse with a faint, rhythmic vibration, like a tiny, dormant heart. He was so unnerved by the sensation that he immediately threw the seed into the kitchen stove, where it was consumed by the embers. For the rest of his life, Carver was haunted by that moment. He was plagued by nightmares in which he had kept the seed and planted it in his own small garden. In his dreams, he would watch as a new tree grew with terrifying speed, its branches heavy, not with fruit, but with the faces of the dead, their eyes open and accusing. He came to believe that Voss's evil was not contained to the man himself, but was a virulent, transmissible thing capable of spreading and taking root in others. The seed was its vessel, and he had come dangerously close to becoming its new caretaker. This personal, terrifying experience was Carver's final secret. The true reason he had fled Harlan County and spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, forever fearful that he had carried a part of the orchard's curse away with him. Today, the site of the former Voss farm is a quiet, unremarkable patch of woodland within a larger state park. The trails are well maintained, and on a bright autumn day it can seem almost peaceful. But the official park map contains a curious anomaly. The area corresponding to the old orchard is marked as an ecological study zone, with signs posted along its perimeter, warning hikers to stay on the designated path. This designation is a piece of bureaucratic fiction, a polite way of keeping people out. The real reason for the restriction is known only to a few senior park officials and local historians. In the 1990s, a park ranger reported a strange discovery. A cluster of wild apple trees had begun to grow in the very center of the restricted zone, the place where Voss's bargain tree once stood. This was thought to be impossible as the ground had been heavily salted and was known to be toxic to most plant life. An arborist was brought in to examine the trees. He found that they were not a known species. They were a strange hybrid, possessing an unusual resistance to blight and an incredibly aggressive root system. The most disturbing finding, however, was the fruit. The apples they produced were small and misshapen, their skin a pale, sickly white. When cut open, the flesh was shot through with thin red veins that bore an unsettling resemblance to blood vessels. The fruit was found to be inedible, containing trace amounts of several unidentified alkaloids that had a mildly hallucinogenic effect on anyone who consumed them. The trees were quietly cut down and their roots poisoned. But every few years, new saplings push their way through the tainted soil. The land is trying to remember. The orchard wants to be reborn. The hunger that Harlan Voss so diligently fed for 28 years did not die with him. It is a part of the soil, a permanent and patient horror, still waiting for a new farmer to come and tend its garden. The horrifying tale of Harlan Voss and his orchard of the dead forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Was Voss a product of a cursed land? A man compelled by a supernatural force? Us. As the local legends and his own journal suggest. Or was he simply a profoundly disturbed individual, a psychopath who created an elaborate mythology to justify his own monstrous appetites? The truth is likely a combination of both. The isolation and ingrained superstitions of Appalachia provided the fertile ground in which his madness could grow, unchecked and unchallenged. He was a perfect storm of a disturbed mind and a complicit society. The hunger below was likely a projection of his own internal void, a void he filled by consuming the lives of others. But the power of the story lies in its ambiguity. The strange vitality of the land, the town's collective denial, the inexplicable phenomena reported over the years. All of these elements prevent us from dismissing the folklore entirely. The case exists in a gray area between true crime and dark legend, between human monstrosity and supernatural malevolence. This is what makes it so enduringly terrifying. It suggests that the world is not as simple as we would like to believe. It hints that there are places where the veil between the rational and the irrational is thin, where ancient hungers can still exert their influence on the hearts of men. Harlan Voss may have been a madman, but he may also have been something more, a conduit for a much older and more patient evil, an evil that was tied to the land itself long before his family ever arrived. The question of whether he was a monster or a servant of a monstrous power is one that can never be truly answered. And it is in that uncertainty that the true horror of the Voss orchard resides. The final legacy of the Voss orchard is one of absence. The absence of the victims from the world, their stories erased, their futures stolen. The absence of justice for the 136 unidentified dead who remain nameless skeletons in a state archive, and the absence of any true understanding. We have the facts of the case, the timeline, the body count. We have the killer's confession and his twisted philosophy. But we will never truly know what it was like for the victims in their final moments. We will never understand the full extent of the community's complicity, the depth of the secrets that died with the older generations. The story, for all its gruesome detail, is ultimately a hollow space defined by what is missing. It is a testament to the fact that some crimes are so vast, so monstrous that they defy our ability to fully comprehend them. They leave behind a wound not just on the land, but on our collective psyche. The tale of the orchard keeper has become a permanent shadow in the history of Kentucky, a story that is both a historical event and a living piece of folklore. It reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not those that hide in the dark, but those that live among us in plain sight. They're evil, hidden behind a facade of normality. It reminds us that beneath the surface of even the most peaceful-looking communities, there can lie a darkness that is deep, ancient, and insatiably hungry. The orchard is gone, but the story remains. A warning that will echo through the Appalachian Hills for generations to come. A warning about the terrible price of secrets and the blood that is required to make them grow. In the aftermath of the trial, investigators conducted extensive interviews with the residents of Harlan County, hoping to understand how such a long-running atrocity could have gone unnoticed. The transcripts of these interviews, though never made public, paint a chilling portrait of collective denial. Most residents claim to have known nothing, expressing shock and horror. But a few of the older citizens under pressure admitted to a long-held suspicion. They spoke of a shadow over the valley, an unspoken understanding that travelers who took shelter at the Voss farm were often not seen again. They didn't know the gruesome details, they insisted. They simply knew that Harlan Voss was a man to be feared and avoided, and that his business was his own. One woman, the granddaughter of the blacksmith, confessed that her grandfather used to receive an anonymous payment every winter, a small bag of silver coins left on his anvil. It was enough to keep his family fed through the lean months. He never asked where it came from, but it always appeared a week after a stranger had been seen heading towards the Voss place. This was the true nature of the town's complicity. It was not a grand conspiracy, but a slow, creeping rot of moral compromise. It was 1,000 small decisions to look away, to not ask questions, to accept the blood money that kept the community afloat. Voss did not need to threaten them into silence. He had bought it year after year with the spoils of his slaughter. He had made them all unwitting shareholders in his enterprise of death. The state investigators concluded that there was not enough evidence to charge anyone else with a crime. The town's sin was one of omission, a crime of the soul that could not be prosecuted in a court of law. The people of Harlan County were left to live with their ghosts, forever bound to the man whose evil they had allowed to flourish in their midst. The question of what happened to the Voss family line is one that has been lost to official history, but it survives in local lore. Harlan was the last to carry the family name, and he had no children. But the Voss blood did not die out completely. Harlan had a younger sister, Elizabeth, who had fled the valley as a teenager in the 1870s. Years before Harlan began his most prolific killing, she had reportedly run away to escape the oppressive, strange atmosphere of her family home and the increasingly erratic behavior of her brother. She moved west, married, and had children of her own, severing all ties with her past. For decades, her descendants lived in ignorance of their dark heritage. However, in the 1990s, a genealogist in the family traced their lineage back to Harlan County, Kentucky. They uncovered the story of Harlan Voss, their great-granduncle. The revelation was a profound shock to the family. One descendant, a woman named Sarah, became obsessed with the story. She traveled to Kentucky, visited the site of the former orchard, and spent weeks reading the archived newspaper accounts of the trial. She later wrote that during her visit, she felt a strange and unwelcome connection to the land, a sense of being called home. She began to suffer from nightmares. The same dreams that had plagued Ethan Carver of a tree that grew human faces. She described a growing morbid fascination with gardening and a strange compulsive desire to test the acidity of her soil. Her family, alarmed by her deteriorating mental state, persuaded her to seek psychiatric help. The story serves as a final, chilling footnote to the Voss case. It suggests that the hunger of the land may not have been just a metaphor, but a kind of inherited madness. A dormant seed of darkness passed down through the bloodline, waiting for the right conditions to take root once more. The disturbing cold case of the farmer who buried strangers beneath his orchard is, in the end, a story about roots. It is about the literal roots of the apple trees that drew their nourishment from death. It is about the deep, tangled roots of a family whose history was intertwined with a dark and bloody pact. It is about a community whose roots were so deep in the soil of tradition and isolation that they could not see or would not see the monster that grew among them. And it is about the victims, the unclaimed men and women who were targeted precisely because they had no roots, no connections that would anchor them to the world and make their absence felt. Harlan Voss's motive in his own mind was to give them roots, to plant them in his cursed garden and transform their meaningless lives into something fruitful. It was a horrifying perversion of the natural order, a philosophy of death masquerading as a celebration of life. Today, the valley is quiet. The woods have reclaimed the salted earth. And the state park offers a facade of peace and tranquility. But the roots of this story run deep. They are embedded in the historical records, in the folklore of the region, and in the very soil of the land itself. They serve as a permanent and chilling reminder that some places are forever stained by the events that transpired there, and that the ghosts of the past are never truly buried. They linger just beneath the surface, waiting for a storm to wash away the topsoil and reveal the bones that lie beneath. For the land is hungry, and the land does not forget. If this tale left you glancing uneasily at your own backyard, you're not alone. Stories like these remind us that history's shadows never fully fade. Drop a comment below. What's the creepiest unsolved mystery from your hometown? Smash that like button if you want more dives into America's forgotten horrors. And subscribe with notifications on so you never miss the next chilling chapter. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the dark. Sleep tight, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are growing right under our feet. See you in the next one.